So, okay. So let's see what I can share with you guys. So I'll share this. Now, let me, okay. Let me stop that and share screen here. Okay. Okay. Can you guys see can you see the PowerPoint now, um, Morgan? It says
Yeah, I see it.
okay, the market forces supply demand. Okay. So I'll go through this presentation and I'll just emphasize the things. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on each and every slide. But this is basically, continuing our introduction to supply and demand. Okay. And maybe I can make it a little bit wider. I don't know. Well, I assume you guys can see it fine on your screen. Um, let's see if I can. Okay. Okay. So, um, yeah. So we talk about supply and demand, and probably, I don't know, um, 3/4 of the material that you're gonna see in this class is about supply and demand. And I gave you guys the context. The big picture is, yeah, economics is about the scientific study of resource allocation mechanisms. That's true. But the mechanism, or the way, the procedure that most goods and services are distributed in our economy, in most modern economies, is um, through market transactions. And I want to be clear because there shouldn't be any confusion about this point. So I'll say it maybe just a couple times in case there's any confusion. But sometimes, markets get blamed. People have misgivings about what happens in markets. And, I'm not really going to comment deeply on that. But I will say that the basis for market transactions in the way that we study them is voluntary trade. And so if you see a trading relationship and so normally there are two primary parties, there's a buyer and a seller. There may be third parties that are affected that aren't the buyer and the seller, but we concentrate on buyer and seller interactions in a trade. Somebody buys something, somebody sells it, and then it's voluntary. They've both decided to engage in that. There's no coercion, no force, no violence, no threat of violence. People just deciding, hey, you got it. I'd like to buy it. Yeah, I'd like to sell it for the amount you're willing to offer to pay me. That whenever there's voluntary trade of that nature, that the trade is mutually beneficial, meaning both parties benefit. The buyer wouldn't buy unless they thought the good was at least worth what they were paying for it. The seller wouldn't sell unless they thought the amount that they were getting for the good was at least to compensate them for getting rid of the good. So if you guys ever believe that you hear some sort of a sincere criticism of some market or market outcomes, then you should start to think to yourselves, well, is there something going on that makes this particular transaction seem like it's not a voluntary trading relationship? And if you see that, then you should note, well, this isn't the type of trade that they're talking about in, mainstream economics. Something else is going on here. And it's important because there are some, platitudes that are often used. And so platitudes are just like these, general statements that things are good or fine or something like that. And they're often used by people who are ideologues. And an ideologue is somebody who believes in an idea kind of independent of the consequences. And I'm not, again, criticizing those people. I'm just pointing something out so you guys can notice when you hear that kind of discussion, because economists, again, we study these things from a scientific point of view, and you normally won't hear um, you know I'll call them good economists making strong unscientific sounding claims. But there are some broad and sweeping statements that we do make in economics, but they're always made in context, and they're based on theory and data to back up the theory. And those statements, because of their sort of broad nature, they can be used by people in the wrong context and people who aren't careful. So one of the most frequently misused statement is that free markets are efficient, and it's that free market part that is often abused, because what we really mean by free is voluntary trading relationships. People are free to engage in the transaction or free not to engage in the transaction. A lot of times people misread that, and they think that free in that context means free to do whatever you want. So like one side can be really aggressive and harsh and threatening in the transaction, the other one you know play some sort of like victim role, and that's a free exchange. But no, it's not free in the sense that free for anybody to do anything they want, including coercion and threats. you know it's voluntary trade that we're talking about. And we'll talk more about efficiency as we get a little bit further in the course, but that's really the first pass idea that describes half of, and particularly the first half of this course, which is free markets are efficient. And so we have to understand, like I said, we're focusing in on markets because markets are used the world around for organizing and distributing the fruits of economic activity. So we want to understand how they work. And so the main model of the market is the supply and demand model. And so that's why these are the words that are most often used by economists. And let me see if I can get it to do what I want it to do without giving me a hard time. But okay, it's giving me a hard time, so I'll have to do this. Okay, so what do we mean by a market exactly? Well, a market is simply just a collection, a group of buyers and sellers, and supply and demand refers to the behavior of the people as they interact with one another in the market. And we've talked about some of these things. Um, Demand is representing buyers and their actions and their behavior, in particular, how they respond to price. And sellers end up determining the supply. Um, so we also have these kind of layered definitions of market, and so there are markets that are not competitive, and we'll talk about markets that deviate from competition. And but a competitive market in particular is the one that we're most interested in, because it's sort of the ideal, and it's where we get the result when we say voluntary trade. That's similar to this idea of the market being competitive. And competitive markets are the ones that are efficient. And again, we're going to talk about that measure of efficiency in a little bit. So to try to get an idea of what it means for the market to be competitive, we have this, these characterizations, this ways of describing what competition is. And actually, if you spend a little bit more time in economics, if it ends up being your major, then you'll get past these kind of first layer characterizations. But when you're first learning economics and you're trying to notice, well, is this market competitive or is it not? Because the efficiency of a market that is not competitive is not guaranteed at all. It's only in competitive markets where we have this guarantee that we'll have an efficient outcome. And so what is a competitive market? Well, one of the ways you can tell that it's likely a competitive market is when there are lots and of buyers and sellers. And the whole idea behind there being lots of buyers and sellers is that people have options, right? I don't have to buy only from this person, or I don't have to sell only to that person. I could buy or sell to any number of different people. And if somebody is engaged in what you might refer to as like a harsh bargain, right? They're you know being unreasonable by some measure, then you just move on to the next person. It's not like anybody has to put up with any sort of bad behavior because there are lots of options available to them when the market's competitive. So now to be more specific, I was saying we're layering on these definitions. So we have this idea of like perfect competition, and in perfect competition, we make it even more explicit that you've got products that are identical to one another. So it's not like, oh, I have to worry about, well, I want to buy a pair of Sevens jeans. And so if I want Sevens jeans, I have to buy them from somebody that sells that particular brand. It's better than that. It's that everybody sells this exact product that I want. So normally when we see things that approximate perfect competition, we're talking about things like agricultural commodities, oranges, apples, wheat and corn. Why? Because those products are um, nearly identical to one another. Now you could differentiate and say, well, some are grown organically and they have different brands of apples, but I don't know about you guys, but if I'm out to buy a Granny Smith apple, I don't look to see did it come from Farmer Susie or Farmer Todd. It's just a green apple. It's sitting there, and the specific manufacturer or the specific farmer doesn't matter. The good's identical, whoever it comes from that's participating as a seller in that market. And there are lots of buyers and sellers. And there's actually, we can layer on some more assumptions later to tell us what happens in perfect competition. But this last bullet point is a really important one. And hopefully you guys can see I kind of highlighted it there. Morgan, can you see my highlight?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, good. So buyers and sellers under perfect competition are what we call price takers. And what it means for them to be price takers is that they simply look out into the market and they look at what's the going price. We're going to call it the equilibrium price, but they can see, right now people are trading Granny Smith apples for $2 a pound. And then they just make their decision based on that information alone. There's no strategy with respect to price because they're such a small part of the market. They realize, oh, I can't say everybody else is charging $2 a pound. As a seller, I can't say I want $5 a pound and expect that that'll actually be a price. Because remember also that you have um, buyers that are offering to buy at a certain price, and you have sellers that are offering to sell at a certain price. And so that can be a little bit confusing because you can think, well, yeah, sure, as a seller, I could demand $5 a pound. But in economics, those those offer prices aren't true prices. A true price is a price where there's a transaction. So when I say, yeah, I mean, I could ask for $5 a pound, but I can't expect to actually have a trade. So that's not a true price because there's no transactions um, at a unreasonably high offer price. So so buyers and sellers don't act in a strategic way with respect to their pricing decisions because there's no way that their strategy could be effective. They're too small um, to actually affect what's going on in the market. So, and to contrast perfect competition, a place where there is um, the ability to actually influence prices, we give the other opposite example, which is common in economics, which is, and we'll study later, which is a monopoly. So in a monopoly, there's just one seller. And because there's just one seller, that seller can dictate the price in a way that often there are transactions. Okay. Um, okay. Let's make sure we didn't skip anything. Okay. So a couple of other types of markets where we wouldn't characterize them as being competitive or is an oligopoly, and we'll study oligopoly too. An oligopoly, there are a few sellers and there's some measure of competition. And then actually, this is one of the last types of markets that we'll study, and I'll highlight it too, is monopolistic competition. And the reason why I'll highlight monopolistic competition is because if you think about it, under monopolistic competition, this is actually what we see in our daily lives most of the time. There are many sellers. So if we talk about food, for example, but when you go out to a restaurant, but the products are slightly differentiated. So Taco Bell is not identical to Del Taco, and they don't try to be, right? And Wendy's is not identical to McDonald's. And if you talk about jeans, Seven's jeans are not the same as Levi's jeans, for example, and they don't try to be. They try to differentiate their product to create some sort of what you might call customer loyalty that gives them some pricing power. So each seller gets to set their price of their product, but they do still compete with one another because obviously, if Del Taco is very unreasonable, then people will find someplace else to get a taco. So there's still competition there, but it's not like perfect competition where all the products are identical. Okay. Um, okay. So again, one of the most important things when we study demand is the language, and we've talked about this a little bit already. We said that demand is a relationship, but you want to differentiate between demand and quantity demanded. That's a really important point. So quantity demanded is the amount that would be purchased at a particular price, and demand is the whole list of prices and quantities. Okay, and we'll show you an example in a minute, and I did one in one of the prior lectures, but this is a little bit review. Um, so and also that relationship is characterized by the law of demand, and it states that other things being equal, the quantity demanded of a good will go down. You get less purchases, right? Consumers will buy less when the price of the good rises, and it works in the opposite way too. If the price goes down, then the quantity that consumers will purchase will go up. So um, I talked about this a little bit last time, but there are three different ways that we can represent this relationship, and one of them is called the demand schedule, which is just a table that gives you in one column a list of potential prices, and in the other column it gives you the list of potential purchases in terms of the quantities that would be demanded. So here we can see at a price of 0, there'd be a quantity demanded of 12 ice cream cones at 50 cents, 10 at $1, 8, and so on. So we just list it. So, but we need both of those columns to completely capture demand. And demand is both of those columns together. In particular, notice that really what demand is about how the quantity demanded changes as we change the price. And as soon as we talk about, because if you think about the law of demand, we said when the price rises, that's a change, right? Then the quantity demanded decreases, that's a change. So you can't talk about demand if you only have one price and one quantity demanded. That's a single point on a demand curve. It's one row here, but it doesn't capture demand overall. You need to have at least two prices and two different quantities so you can talk about how the quantity demanded responds, right? And so we said demand was about consumer behavior. So we're actually talking about how the consumer's behavior changes as the price they face for the good changes. So for capturing that relationship, you need, um, you know, the lists of both prices and quantities so you can talk about how consumers behavior will change, how their purchases will change as the price they face for the good changes. Okay, so we can also represent it as a demand curve, and again, a curve is just a general term for what they call in math a locus of points on the graph. And so even though we say it's a curve, most of the time we're just talking about linear demand curve, so it's a straight line. So you can see in this graph, and I suppose we're still good, right, Morgan? You can see everything fine?
Yeah, I see it.
Yeah. So this is just plotting those points that we had from our demand schedule on a set of axes. Now, you guys should know, and I think maybe I mentioned it once before, that this is your standard Cartesian plane, and we're locked into quadrant one, so we don't pay attention to negative prices and negative quantities because in most applications we don't need to. So if you just think about your XY coordinate plane and quadrant one and plot the points and join them together, then you end up with this demand curve. And sure enough, as the price decreases, you can see there's going to be an increase in the quantity demanded. Okay. So market demand refers to the sum of all the individual demands for a particular good. When they say individual demands there, they mean the demands of particular individuals in the market, particular buyers. And we could also, plot a demand curve for just one person in the market, and then add up the quantities for different individuals and sum up or aggregate those demand curves into a market demand curve. And this is kind of an important term here in the second bullet point where it says horizontally sum. So if you think about it, you're adding up the quantities, which are the horizontal dimension, in order to get the market demand curve. So one of the things that comes up immediately in a lot of questions is differentiating between shifts in demand curves and movements along a demand curve. Okay, so you can have a change in the quantity demanded by just having a movement along a particular demand curve from one price to another change, which is caused by a change in the price of the product. So, for example, we've got a single demand curve here. We're changing the price from $1 to $2, and you see we move from point A to point B, and the quantity demanded changes from 8 to 4. So that's what we mean by a movement along the demand curve. Nothing's happened to demand, it's exactly the same, but the price of the product is different, so the quantity that the consumers want to purchase changes. Now, we want to differentiate between movements along a demand curve, which is, one type of question that we can ask, and what we call shifts in a demand curve. Now, shifts in a demand curve cause the entire demand relationship to move graphically in our plane where we're graphing them. And there are a number of things that can actually cause demand curves to shift. And but there are some general categories we talk about. One of them is consumers' income. As you can imagine, that as consumers' incomes increase, it tends to be the case that they're less sensitive to the price of a good. So if they purchase one amount at a particular price, the amount they'd purchase if their income goes up is greater. So they'd buy more of the good. And we'll talk about that in more detail, but it affects the way the demand curve looks and when you have a change in the consumer's income. And also prices of related goods. So we're going to talk about substitutes and complements in detail, but just as a first pass at this, you can imagine that if you have one product and another product that's a close substitute, then if the price of the substitute product changes, goes up or goes down, it's going to shift consumers' purchasing behavior. So maybe I was going to go buy a taco at Del Taco, but I found out they're having a sale at Taco Bell. So I changed my mind. And since the price of the substitute taco, the Taco Bell taco, went down, I go and I purchase Taco Bell tacos and increase the demand for Taco Bell tacos and decrease the demand for Del Taco tacos. So changes in the prices of closely related goods can affect the demand for each of those goods respectively. So and tastes for products. This is a little bit more general catch-all term, but um, you know, sometimes products are popular and sometimes they're not. I don't know if you guys have any really good experience with this, um, but the example I always tell people about is so I'll take a volunteer for this question. Um, does anybody know what parachute pants are? Parachute pants.
Yes.
Okay, so who said yes first? I heard yes, but I can't see because I don't have everything up. So identify yourself.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Who is this?
No, it's Chris Chang. I'm a student. This is my first session, but yeah, parachute pants are just giant pants. They're popular in the '90s. They were like ginormous, and I think NC Hammer made them popular on what was that like?
Hammer time.
Yeah, Hammer Time.
Yeah, and so yeah, so I can tell you guys in 1991, um, I was walking in the Cerritos Mall, and I thought for a moment that I would look really good in a pair of parachute pants. So I purchased parachute pants, and I wore them for about 6 weeks. And then I tried to burn all the photos. Luckily, it was way before, Instagram, so there's no electronic evidence of this. Um, but yeah, I mean, like, why would I buy parachute pants? Well, everybody was buying parachute pants. They were cool, right? And then they got suddenly not cool. So so anyway, yeah, tastes for goods change, and that affects the demand for the goods. Um, the next bullet point is about expectations, and this is kind of really interesting. So actually, what we're talking about is expectations, particularly in the future price of the good. So it tends to be the case, um, and this happens a lot of times. I don't know if you guys do this with gasoline purchases or not. Gas prices are pretty cheap right now, but they were even less expensive, kind of like at the beginning of COVID. But a lot of times, if people see that it looks like prices are going to go down, they'll wait to purchase today, and that'll decrease the demand today because they're waiting to take advantage of that price decrease tomorrow. Or if they think prices are going to go up tomorrow, something happens, they're like, uh-oh, I know the price of, and this happens a lot of times in agricultural commodities like orange juice, right? Um, so you guys may not know this, but big agricultural products are traded every day on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And if there's a big storm that hits Florida and they know it's going to destroy a lot of the orange crop, then they know orange prices are going to be going up. And so, sure enough, you'll see there's an increase in demand to get the orange juice now. And it drives up current prices too, but it's because of this expectation about what's going to be happening in the future with the price of the good. And sometimes it also happens with respect to consumers' expected future income. If you guys, are expecting to graduate and you think you're going to have a degree in something and you're going to get a certain salary, maybe you've been doing computer science or electrical engineering, or the really hot thing for a while was petroleum engineering, which I don't think we do at Cal Poly, but petroleum engineers were walking out with a bachelor's degree making like $160,000 a few years ago, with a 4-year degree. And but you may not know this, but because of COVID, all of the oil exploration and extraction has really been shut down in a lot of the country, and the future salaries of petroleum engineers, if they're not getting laid off, has gone way down. So what happens is people say, oh, well, I expect I'm going to be making this great salary. And so maybe they run up a lot of debt. Their demand is really high for lots of goods and services. And then there's some, change, and their expectations change about what their future earning potential is going to be. And that affects their demand for the goods and services. So expectations about how changes in what's going to happen in the future and people's thinking about that can affect their demand for goods and services today. And the last one, really, we don't talk about a whole lot, but it's, the number of buyers and the numbers of sellers in the market. So you can have things particularly related to technology. You guys probably know that if you buy stuff on Amazon or Alibaba or some other site, that there's a big potential market out there because the internet can reach so many different consumers. And the more consumers it can reach, then the greater the demand. Because remember, you're just adding on the quantities demanded by each of the consumers. So if you add more consumers to the market for some reason, suppose, payment systems go into developing countries that allow them to buy goods off of Amazon or something like that, they're going to see an increase in demand because there's an increase in the number of buyers. And I'll tell you something, it doesn't just have to do with technology. A lot of the times it has to do with forecasting demand in the future based on population growth. So I spent a couple of years as a economic consultant for the Inland Empire Utility Agency and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. They're the big water suppliers. So if you guys took a shower today, that water came through a reservoir or a pipeline that was managed by the Metropolitan Water District. And the Metropolitan Water District uses population forecasts to figure out how many people are going to be in the Los Angeles area 30 years from now, so they can build the infrastructure to serve that many consumers. So again, the idea is that I know there are going to be more people purchasing water in the future because the population is growing, and so the demand is going to be greater because we have more buyers in the market. Simple idea. Okay, so a change in the demand curve, right, isn't merely a change in the price, right? It's a change in the whole relationship. It's a shift in the demand curve. And the demand curve is either going to shift to the left or to the right. Now, I will tell you that most students, the biggest mistake that they make when they're first thinking about these things, and I'm not saying it's never useful to do this, but it's a common way to, in many cases, analyze the problem incorrectly. Not always, but a lot of times it leads to an incorrect result. So it's better to not do this. A lot of times students think of the demand curve as shifting up or down. Try not to do that, even though it's going to look like it's up or down. Try to think of it as being left or right, because really what matters is the quantity that's going to be purchased, and we're measuring quantity on the horizontal axis. So either the quantity is going to increase or it's going to decrease, which is going to be either a leftward or a rightward shift in the demand curve. So that's just a word of warning. When you're looking at these graphs, try to think left, right, almost always. There's one exception I'll tell you about later where thinking about up and down will actually help. But most of the time, 90% of the time, it's left or right. There's just one exception. So, so, um, so, so it can be caused by any change that alters the quantity demanded at every price. And that's kind of important. These shifters that we talked about, they're going to affect the quantity at every price. So, yeah, a little bit of context. So this is what it looks like. So our original demand curve is the blue one, and a rightward shift is an increase in demand. And so what you can see is at any particular price, there's going to be a greater quantity demanded than there was before if we have that rightward shift. So let's see. Well, I'll assume that you guys can follow that on your own. If you have a big question about why it's a rightward or leftward shift, we can talk about it. But yeah, an increase is a rightward shift, and decrease is a leftward shift. So you guys can see those labeled on the graph there. Are there any questions about that? No. We're still going to talk about this in more detail, so it's not a big deal if you do have a question. So I'll dig a little bit deeper into each one of these topics. So the first one that we talked about that could cause a shift in income, a shift in demand, is a change in the consumer's income. So we have two different cases there. So one of the cases is the case for what we would call a normal good. And you could say a normal good is like what normally happens. And so for a normal good, as the consumer's income increases, they tend to buy more of that good. So that would be a rightward shift or an increase in demand. But there are some goods that are what we call inferior goods. And for inferior goods, when the consumer's income increases, it actually causes a decrease in the demand for an inferior good. So now I'll go ahead and I'll bring the chat.
So,
And I'll ask you guys, so who would like to volunteer? If you want to volunteer, just type VOL in the chat and I'll look and then I'll call on you. Do I have a volunteer? Okay. So, okay, so my question is going to be for my volunteer, do you guys have any examples of inferior goods? So do you have an example of an inferior good? And then I'll sing the song to you guys just to give you guys a chance to think about this. And the song is, if you think you know the answer, volunteer or raise your hand. If you think you know the answer, volunteer, raise your hand. If you really, really know it and you want to show it, if you think you know the answer, raise your hand. Okay, so I actually had two volunteers, and so we'll take an example from each one of them. So Christopher Cheng, you're my first volunteer. So give me an example of an inferior good. What do you
Well, my example is a little bit more complicated, but because cell phone, we're sort of advancing in terms of 5G, 4G. Eventually, our little handheld computers are going to be so advanced that we're going to need more technology. So I would say, like in regards to that, like sort of old semiconductors that are going to be phased out when we come out with better phones. So yeah, so this old semiconductors.
Okay, so you're saying that if your income goes up, that you won't want to buy the old chips, the slow chips, the bad technology, but you'd rather buy good technology. You're and I think that could work, but I'll just stick a pin in that. I'm not saying that you're at all wrong. I think you're actually probably right that people with higher incomes buy, you're going to buy the new iPhone 11. You're not going to buy so your demand for, I don't know what's the worst smartphone on the market. A used, you know, Android Jelly Bean, you know,
Raspberry Pi.
yeah, like something like that. You're not gonna purchase more of those as your income goes up. So that's probably right. But we could probably make it a little bit more simple than that. But I think I agree with you. Okay, what about you, Christian? What's your example? Your income goes up and you buy less what?
So my answer was that canned goods.
Canned goods. Yeah, so right, like canned green beans, as your income goes up, maybe unless you're like a doomsday prepper person, right? But if your income goes up, you just buy more like fresh organic green beans. You're not gonna buy, you know, um, yeah, the canned stuff. So I think I could go with that. What about you, Morgan? What's your example?
I was thinking like the knockoffs of stuff, like fake bags or something.
Right. Okay, that's a good one. You're not gonna buy more of the fake Gucci, the Gucky, right? You're gonna buy the real Gucci if your income goes up. Well, I'll go with that. And what about you, Nicole? Are you with us, Nicole? You were talking about Huawei gear, but you have something more simple than that?
What?
Are
Sorry, one
Uh-oh.
minute.
Okay.
Okay, what?
So we were talking about inferior good examples. Is your
Oh, me versus my sister. I'm the inferior good.
oh, so as our income goes up, we would want
You'd
less
ask her
of
for help because she's better than I.
less of your help, more.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but you must. So, do you have anything that if your income went up, you would stop purchasing that you currently purchase? I don't know.
Uh,
You may already be
I'd
wealthy.
probably
I don't know.
purchase better Arduinos that aren't made with child labor because sometimes I don't think they pay the kids enough and some parts come screwed up. But
So what is it? You'd buy less what?
Arduinos, they're just
Arduino.
like just when you go on AliExpress or Alibaba and you go out to purchase like little pieces of tech, you're not
Oh,
really getting premium stuff, but it's really
okay.
cheap.
Oh, okay. So it's okay. So you'd buy better gear. Okay. 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 So let's see.
Hey, professor,
Yeah.
what about fast food?
Who's speaking?
Benjamin Rose?
Benjamin Rose. Okay,
Yeah,
Benjamin. Yeah, so it probably depends, right? But
yeah,
yeah, I think that you're right. I mean, you might get off of the dollar menu at I don't know, like, because like sometimes they have little dollar menu options. You might not buy stuff off of the dollar menu at McDonald's, but instead
Hmm.
you're gonna buy other stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll give you guys a few classic examples because I think we kind of fleshed it out. But yeah, one of the ones that's often mentioned in textbooks is bus tickets, right? So when people have less income, a lot of times they will ride the bus. And then when their income increases, they'll buy a car instead. So the demand for bus ticket tends to actually go down when income increases. And we kind of hit it on the head a little bit with the canned goods, but more generally, it's things that are generic. So it tends to be, generic items are less desirable than the name brand. So when income is down, right, people tend to buy more of the generic goods. And when income increases, they switch out of the generic goods back to the name brands. So, and this is kind of actually, there's one other thing, and this will, I'm an economist, and people, um, when they learn that, oftentimes the first thing they do is they ask me for stock market advice, and like what are
Somebody
good.
has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Hold on just a second. Um, Daniel, you have a question? Just let me finish this, and then we'll get back to you. Okay. So thanks a lot, Morgan. So and Christopher has a question too. Okay, give me just a second. So hold on. Now you guys made me forget where I was going. So we talked about generic. Oh, so they asked me for stock market tips, and you know, I don't do a lot of stock picking that I would share with other people because it's inherently volatile. But there's one good tip in general to remember, and it has to do with inferior goods. So the stocks that did the best during the Great Recession were stocks like the Dollar Tree and the Dollar General. And you'll notice that normally, right, so the deal with the 99-cent stores is they sell things for $1 or less, and they sell small quantities, right? So when people's incomes go down, they tend not to buy um, large quantities because they're just trying to avoid the cost and to make it through to their next paycheck. So actually, like the small boxes of Tide and the small quantities that you can get, and also probably products that are otherwise generic or not you know in fashion, or what they sell at the dollar store, and all of those tend to be inferior products. Those are products where if income goes down, generally the demand for them increases. But when income generally goes up, like after a recession, then fewer people go to the Dollar Tree and the dollar store. They start going back to Target and Walmart or other places where they can get name brand products. Okay, so we had a couple of questions in the chat. And so I actually think the first one that came up was Christopher. Did you have a quick question?
Oh yeah. So my question is regarding to the this sort of if you're wealthier, you buy like cars, and I think while that is true, I think nowadays everyone's sort of trying to be closer to where they work or try to be near public transportation. Like, does that sort of affect everything? Because I
Well,
don't.
yeah. Obviously, there can be trends, changes in technology that affect that kind of behavior. But I'm just talking, it's generally still the rule that most people, like for most of you guys, I don't know if you guys have a car or you don't have a car, but when you get your first job, most of you will get a better or a newer vehicle. And if you were somebody that was taking the bus a lot before, and You know, ride sharing again changes things or changes technology, but still cars tend to be a normal good. As people's income increases, their tendency to purchase vehicles, that's still what's going on. But you're right. I mean, technology and mobility and things like that can change that behavior. Um, okay. But like I said, right now, I still think it's a good example. Um, and then Daniel Benitez, were you going to ask a question?
No, sorry.
Okay. And so I got no other questions. Okay. So we still have a few more minutes. So I'm gonna put the chat down and continue on. So this is the graph of our example. And here we're assuming that ice cream is a normal good. And I think that's probably true. As people's income goes up, they tend to buy more ice cream. So you have demand one, which is the original demand curve, and you have an increase in income, and then it shifts the demand curve to the right. And notice that means at each and every price, like at $2 a cone, the quantity is going to be bigger than it was before because of the increase in income. Okay. And here's our graphical example of an inferior good. So now, again, we're assuming, you know, ice cream is an inferior good. And depending upon your perspective, I don't know if you guys have any ice cream that you really like or ice cream that you would otherwise avoid. But, you know, maybe it's the cheap ice cream. It's not Ben and Jerry's. It's like, you know, the ice milk type ice cream. And as income increases, now consumers are purchasing a smaller amount than they were before. So you get a leftward shift in demand. So that's our illustration. So the next main thing that we want to talk about is the price of related goods, substitutes and complements. And so I'll just give you a general introduction, and then because we're running low on time, I'll pick up on this next time we get together. But so read these statements carefully. So it says, when a fall or a decrease in the price of one good reduces the demand for another, the two goods are called substitutes. So I want you to think about that, right? That's just a definition, and it's related to how the price of one good affects the demand for another, right? And contrast that with the second bullet point, which says when you have a decrease in the price of one good and it causes an increase in the demand for another good, those two goods are called complements. So substitutes are probably, that's a word you guys are familiar with. I don't think there's any mystery there. But the word complement, the way that it's spelled, notice it's not compliment with an I. It's not, you know, being polite or saying something nice. It's complement with an E. And so complement with an E means that the two things go together. So lots of people come up with examples like peanut butter and jelly, coffee and cream, chips and salsa, but the two products are used together. They tend to be used together. And for substitute goods, again, either one of them or the other tends to be used. You know, maybe Coke is a substitute for Pepsi, something like that. But notice that it says that when you've got a fall in the price of one good, it reduces the demand for another good, right? And so a lot of times, I'll give you guys a really quick example. And notice we just put 5 factors there. So as a economist that goes to conferences and presents research, and done that quite a lot in the past. Normally when you go to these research conferences, they assign you to comment on other people's papers, and you go to those sessions and you give comments on their papers too. And so about a decade ago, I was assigned a paper to give comments on for a guy who was the chief economist for the American Poultry Association. So the American Poultry Association represents all of they're a trade group of all of the big chicken producers. So like Tyson Chicken, and I don't know, you guys could probably name the other chicken brands if you know you needed to. And he had run this analysis of all the factors that affect the demand for chicken. And as you might have imagined, right, as substitutes for chicken, he had the price of other sources of protein. So, for example, you know, when the price of ground beef goes down, right, that's a substitute for chicken, because you might be saying to yourself on any given night, oh, I don't know if I want to have chicken tonight, I don't want to have ground beef. You look at the prices, you know, the ground beef is on sale, so you buy the ground beef and you don't buy the chicken. So a decrease in the price of ground beef causes a decrease in the demand for chicken. That's pretty obvious. But he had 167 of these things. And the one that was most surprising to me is that he found out statistically that airline tickets, their prices affected the demand for chicken. In particular, he found out when there was a decrease in the price of airline tickets, there tended to be an increase in the demand for chicken. So does anybody want to explain that to me? I'll give a last comment if anybody wants to volunteer to explain why.
Well, you said airplanes. No, Lawrence.
Who's speaking? Lawrence?
Lawrence, yeah.
Yeah.
Lawrence.
Okay. So what do you think? Why is it? And basically, it like peanut butter and jelly. What he's saying is that airline tickets and chicken tend to go together. So when the price of airline tickets goes down, people buy more chicken.
Well, because I think because chickens is cheaper, and also
Now,
I think
no,
chicken
well,
is the
no,
cheapest.
I'm saying you're holding the price of chicken constant. Chicken is like $3 a pound. But when airline tickets go down, right? So airline tickets, let's say, are $100 or $200 a piece. When they go down by $50, that people at the same price for chicken, chicken's $3 a pound, they buy more chicken.
Oh, I don't know, sir.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. But you know what? I asked him the same thing, because you wouldn't really think like airline tickets, chicken. It's because of the in-flight meals. So when the price of airline tickets go down, more people are flying. So the airlines buy more chicken because they're serving more in-flight meals.
Do people even eat those?
In-flight, well, apparently some, because they're serving them, they're buying the chicken. So,
I've never seen an in-flight meal.
well,
In-flight chicken meal.
an in-flight chicken meal. Well, international flights, I don't know, you know. But there are lots of people up in the sky at one time. But I will say this.